Hi, Ben.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Doing good today. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You are Benjamin Perry, author of a book we're going to talk about called Cry Baby. That's Cry, comma, Baby. Subtitle is Why Our Tears Matter. You're a minister at the Middle Church in Manhattan, I think. And you've written for the Washington Post, Slate, Sojourners, and so on. I should
Now the Atlantic.
say, and the Atlantic. Now the Atlantic, because what? An excerpt from the book or something, or an adapted
Yeah,
essay?
yeah. They printed an adapted essay for the first chapter.
Hey, congratulations!
Thank you.
So this is a step down after that, right? I mean, this is merely Bob's podcast, and you've been on the Atlantic.
No, I'm just working up, baby.
This is a step up, you think?
This is Zenith.
Good. A little memo for Jeff Goldberg. I should say we know each other a little. When I was visiting professor of science and religion at Union Theological Seminary, you had just gotten your Master's of Divinity there, and were actually working there for a while. We worked together a little.
We did.
And
yeah, I was working in their communications department, doing some
that's
public
right.
theology
You're still in that business, I see. You're communicating.
Sure am.
And I thought, when I saw you had this book, I have a longstanding interest in crying, which may come up. And so I thought we should talk about this. Now, my first question, though.
Yeah.
You had a book party, right?
I did.
And did you, at the book party, this is the question, did somebody play Janis Joplin's song, Cry Baby? No?
I wished we didn't. I had a whole list I had like a party playlist of all these different crying songs. And then I got there and Housing Works was like, oh, actually our like audio for the whole thing isn't that good. So we can't do the
Is that true?
But it was on my playlist. It
was on your playlist.
It was on my playlist.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
That along with there's this fabulous gay cowboy named Orville Peck who has a new song called Cry Baby Cry. That was the other one that I was pairing right next to it on the playlist.
Okay. Well, I'm glad. So my respect for your marketing sensibility only grows as we speak. I'm glad you had the Janis Joplin angle. And so at the book party, did you talk about the book? Did you give a little talk?
I did.
What did you say? Because I'm thinking the kinds of things you said may be the kinds of things you'd like to say to our audience. I don't know.
Yeah, we talked, and I actually did the book party with a comedian friend of mine, and so we did a little bit of a laughter and tears kind of thing, where we're sort of straddling that gap. Yeah, I'm happy to sort of dive into a little bit of sort of where the book came from, which I think is a nice sort of entree to sort of where
that's union related. Is it not kind of?
Yeah. I mean, so the book started, at least the experience that grounded the book started when I was in seminary. Well, I guess it started when I had, was a little kid and stopped crying, if you really want to get chronological about it. But when I got to seminary, I realized that I hadn't cried for like more than a decade. And I was in a class and our professor was asking us to reflect on experiences of weeping. And we were in little small groups, and I was listening as one by one my classmates were telling these beautiful stories about moments they cried that changed them, that brought them closer to somebody, they had an experience of transformation. And as the conversation was going around the circle, I was racking my brain, and I realized that I couldn't even remember the last time that I had cried, let alone wept in earnest. And it was this watershed moment for me where I realized that along the way something in me had ossified, because it wasn't that I would, as I looked at that truth more deeply, it wasn't just that I wasn't crying anymore. It was that I actually really didn't feel very deeply anymore. I think that's oftentimes how people stop crying, is you stop deeply feeling. The crying is almost the opposite of a canary in the coal mine. It's the last thing that goes. By the time you stop crying, you've already emotionally deadened yourself so deeply. And I really wanted to feel again. And so first year seminarians are a little bit extreme. And
Let me ask you first, did everyone else in the class have like a fairly recent crying memory?
Yeah, or if not a recent one, at least a really pivotal one,
Hmm.
within, a couple of years or something, but something that really meant something to them. And I just realized like I just didn't have anything. And it was, and more that it like I didn't have a crying experience. I just didn't have the kinds of deep emotion that other people were talking about. Um, you know, so I went home and I decided I was going to make myself cry. And I remember thinking it was going to be really easy. Like, oh, we all, start off the world crying. It's going to be simple to cry again. And I sat down and I was like, okay, body, go. Like, here it is. I haven't done this for over a decade. Like, here's the moment. You've been waiting for it. And it didn't happen. It was more difficult than I imagined to break that kind of emotional numbness that I'd cultivated for myself. And so it took me hours that first day. I like tried to watch sad movies. I was listening to music that would hopefully make me cry. I got to the point where I was just Googling things that make you cry and just clicking the results and trying to, hit something that would work for me, and it wouldn't. And so finally I got to the point where I was literally picturing my parents dying because I'm very close with them. And I was picturing
They
what I
were
would
they
say.
were still alive, and you were
They still
picturing.
are. Yeah, they still are. And I was literally picturing them dying and thinking about what I would say to them in that moment, and more to the point, what I hadn't yet told them because I wasn't out to them at this point in my life. And, there were parts of me that I just still hadn't revealed,
You hadn't told them
being
you were gay
that
or
I was, yeah, queer and, gender fluid and all sorts of different
okay.
things. Um, and I really hadn't had any of those kinds of deep conversations with them, even though that I was so close to them. And it was that feeling of what would I lose if they were to die today, these conversations that I wouldn't get to have, that
Hmm.
all of a sudden just broke this dam inside of me. And all of a sudden I started crying, and at that point it felt like I was never going to stop. I just started weeping and weeping. It was like all this pent up stuff just coming out of my body. And then afterwards I felt incredible, like not in the immediate crying, but like, an hour later I was like, oh my God, I feel alive in a way that I had not in so long. And so I started this weird spiritual experiment where I was like, I'm going to cry every day. In retrospect, I can talk about it like it was like this, lofty goal of trying to learn how to feel again. But like, honestly, it just felt so good to cry that I was like, this is something I've been missing, and I'm going to do this every day. Uh, and what happened was over the course of several months, I just became a person who cried more easily. I just became a person who felt more
Hmm.
deeply, to the point that, in the beginning, I usually would have to go home at the end of the day. And before I did my coursework or went out to hang out with my friends, I would, sit down and make myself cry and go through the same kinds of emotional
Did you
exercises,
have
the
to
same.
change the stimuli, as they say in
Yeah,
psychology?
definitely.
I because I
Yep.
would think you would get inured
Yeah,
to any
numb.
given
Yeah,
cue.
so I would watch videos of refugees talking about like their experiences, or I would watch, pets getting reunited with family, like anything that, yeah, I would keep varying the stimuli, but what I found was that, week two was a little bit easier to get myself there. And then week three was even a little easier to get myself there. And then by the time, month two, month three was rolling around, a lot of times I didn't have to go home at the end of the day and make myself cry because I had just already cried somewhere out in the world. And now, I really stopped I don't even remember being like, okay, experiment done. Oh, it's
Mhm.
over. Because I just became someone who cried a lot. And
Hmm.
I cry most days.
Do you
Not
really?
always, yeah, not always like weeping, but yeah, almost
On
every.
like intentionally or
No, just I usually like I'm reading something. I mean, a lot of my work is, responding to things that are happening into the news and the world, and usually just reading something that somebody says, some story that's happening, some quote from an article will make me tear up. Sometimes I, really cry in earnest. Like my grandmother's in the hospital right now, and so I've been crying, more intently the last, week or two than I have been in a while. Um, but usually there's some moment in the day that will make me
so
tear
it's
up
no
at the
longer
very
a
least.
ritual the way it was for those several months. It's no longer
No,
a,
I just
but it happens.
yeah, my emotions are just that much nearer to the surface. And I think that
Hmm.
that's something that I learned in sort of, this experience was how much I was experiencing simulacra of emotion before then. In
You may have to
college and
define. You
in
may
high
have to
school.
define that
I
that
will. I will.
term.
So in the
In the famous book
in
Simulacra and Simula, what is there's some French philosopher who wrote a book with
yeah,
this
that's
title, but
Eliade, isn't it?
who knows?
Um, but in The in the book, my book, not that one. I use like Plato's
Yours is more
allegory of
accessible than that one. We
that's
can
true.
confidently report.
I use Plato's allegory of the cave as like a sort of analogy that, I was watching shadows flicker on the walls of my heart and making myself believe that they were real.
Mm-hmm.
Like I would, feel happy. I could name the emotions. Like if, you gave me like one of those little charts they use for kids where they're like, point to the cow says moo. I could say, oh yes, this feels happy. This feels sad. This feels,
Mm-hmm.
anxious. But all of those experiences were closer to just a static baseline than any kind of heightened emotion. Um, and what I was able to gain through sort of teaching myself to cry again was this ability to deeply feel. Now, when I get sad, oftentimes I will get very sad. If I get happy, I will be really actually euphoric. Um, and I was really excited about talking with you because I love your
Because I
work on
seem like
Buddhism.
the opposite.
No, because I love your work on Buddhism. And I think so much of Buddhism is being mindful of one's emotional state. And I'm not necessarily in the business of fetishizing emotions
Right.
in and of themselves. But I think that not experiencing an emotion deeply is in some core way, depriving ourselves of a fundamental part of our humanity and a fundamental part of what connects us with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
I'm interested in that balance of how do you,
Well,
both be mindful of your emotions while also feeling them fully.
yeah, it's an interesting feature of Buddhism, and I think an often misunderstood one, that Buddhist practice can, and a lot of people would say should, a certain kind of Buddhist meditative practice, including mindfulness meditation, um, should move one toward equanimity. That's part of the idea, but it's a mistake to think of that as a kind of emotional numbness. It is, because there's a certain sense in which you are capable of getting closer to emotions, observing them more closely, feeling them in a certain sense at a finer grain, but being less reactive in a certain sense to them. Um, I don't know. I mean, actually, cry. I hadn't thought about this, but one thing I recommend to people who've never meditated is just, uh, and if they think they might not be good at it or something, sometime when they're feeling sad, I say sit down and just observe what you feel. And I think one thing I noticed the first time I did this is some of the things you feel when you're sad, even if you're not going to cry, you feel some of the muscles that would be activated by crying. It's almost like part of sadness is incipient crying.
Mm-hmm.
If you pay attention to how you feel when you feel sad, you'll probably realize that part of the emotion is to get yourself a little ready for crying. I think I'm not confident of this because I've never said it before this way, but I remember realizing that there's a lot of action right around here when you're sad.
Yeah.
But anyway, the larger point is that, mindfulness can bring you this interesting. I mean, what I'm wondering now is, so does mindfulness practice make you more readily experience sadness without the crying because you're less reactive to the emotions? I honestly don't know. I've certainly cried at meditation retreats, uh, more than once, for what that's worth. But I don't know. What were you thinking when you brought up Buddhism?
Yeah, I mean, my instinct is perhaps that being more mindful allows us to both experience the emotion more deeply while simultaneously and almost paradoxically being less reactive to it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that to me feels like something that I have noticed as I have just done more, of my own therapy and the bits of meditation that I'm able to bring myself to sit down and do, and certainly prayer and other kinds of spiritual practice, as well as chaplaincy and other experiences of providing care. I've gotten better at being attentive to my own emotional state without letting it sort of dictate exactly how I'm going to be moving or like control me. I'm able
Mm-hmm.
to sort of both observe and really truly name and experience what I'm feeling in the fullness of it. And oftentimes that does bring me to a place of crying.
Hmm.
which I think just for me, and because we cry in response to so many different kinds of emotion, like I will cry if I'm incredibly joyful. I definitely cried at my book launch because this was like this apotheosis of this thing that I had been longing for since I found out that that was how books came into the world. I remember like a teacher telling me like, "Oh yeah, you know these things you love, like people write them," and it was like, "What? People? I could write one?" And so like this moment of, just being here, finally having written a thing that I've wanted to write my entire life was so joyful that I definitely, was tearing up at
Well,
the
and you
event.
were in a socially
Um,
supportive environment. I mean, that
exact,
can the perception that a lot of people are supporting you in some really important endeavor can bring tears, right?
yeah, that like reciprocity, yeah, for sure. And so, yeah, what I think I've gotten better at doing is, and it almost feels ironic to me is that like when I look back at a time when I was really more detached from my emotions, I actually feel like I was less good at like making decisions in ways that felt like I was acting from a place of calm,
Hmm.
from a place of mindfulness, even though I was like not as overtly emotional. I certainly would like get really frustrated and give something up, or I would, get upset and angry with a friend and would, say something I didn't mean, even though I wasn't necessarily feeling the same kind of heightened emotion. I
Hmm.
wasn't very good at, examining the way that it was affecting me.
Well,
And
that's
now,
being reactive to what to emotion. I mean, that's what I meant when I said ideally through
yeah.
mindfulness, you're less reactive while more aware of the feelings.
Well, and what was really interesting to me, so like for the book, I did a ton of different interviews with, different folks because I wanted to make sure that this book reflected more experiences crying than, I carry in my little body. Um, and it was interesting how thoughtful so many people are about crying, and particularly like when they stopped or why they feel uncomfortable crying. It was this interesting contrast in sort of universality and particularity, where I heard very similar things from all different kinds of people about feeling this shame around crying, feeling like there were lots of different circumstances where they weren't comfortable crying, feeling that they had this sort of experience of wrong embodiment, that when they cry, it felt like there was some sort of cognitive dissonance. Um, and yet, when I asked them to sort of dig deeper, the reasons why they felt those experiences were so particular. So everyone's sort of hitting this similar place of being uncomfortable with tears. But I would talk to, Black folks who would share with me, oh yes, I'm actually really comfortable crying in like an all Black setting, but when I'm in, my white office place, I feel like I can't cry because then it will confirm people's
Hmm.
racist expectations about who I am. Or I would talk to women who would say, oh yes, I feel really uncomfortable crying because I feel it will confirm prejudices people have about, women's inability to lead or be professional in the
Hmm.
workplace. Or I would talk to queer people who would say, oh, I had so much shame around my body, around my sexuality growing up, that it really divorced me from crying. And so now I feel this
Hmm.
real ambiguity when it comes to weeping that I didn't have when I was really young, before I had those kinds of formative experiences. And so it was really interesting to hear how all of these people got to a very similar place of feeling like this core human experience was something that they had trouble fitting into their lives and reconciling with their identity, even though the reasons why they felt that way were so varied.
Yeah, well, I would assume. I mean, one category you didn't mention is kind of straight men, but according to
I
classic
have a whole
stereotype, they're
chapter on
certainly
that.
not supposed to cry, right?
That's who I start with. I have a whole chapter called "Cowboys Don't Cry," which that line is taken from a interview I did with this guy who grew up on a West Texas cattle ranch, and he said that that was his grandfather's like adage to him, like repeatedly throughout childhood.
Cowboys
I
don't
guess
cry.
he would start. He has shared this story of like lifting these heavy ranch gates when he was like 7.
Hmm.
He had a different kind of childhood than I had. And was being really frustrated lifting these gates, and he would start to get to the point where he was about to cry, and his grandfather would just cut in and say, yeah, "Cowboys don't cry."
Yeah.
And he talks very astutely and with a lot of emotional clarity on the way that he funneled that crying into anger. And he learned to play football. He learned to take the sad or the upset feelings that he had inside of himself and not to channel them into crying, and instead learned to to hit him harder on the football field, or
Hmm.
get release that pent up feeling, that emotionality through anger. And now he is older. and experiencing this shame that he has about not being emotionally available that is so intimately linked to the shame he experienced toward being emotionally vulnerable.
Now you mentioned you said there were Black people sometimes, or maybe you were just mentioning a Black person who didn't want to cry, I guess, in the workplace for fear of reinforcing stereotypes. One thing you mentioned in your book, I forget whether this is some kind of actual social science finding or something based on people you've talked to or something, but you said there, among American Blacks, there's a little bit more of an acceptance of crying and of communal crying, like crying together. I mean, I wasn't aware of that, so I'm almost surprised to hear that the Black person you just mentioned would have thought they were confirming any kind of stereotype by crying. But in any event, that was an interesting finding to me.
Yeah, so that's not from a sociological study, I'll say off the bat. That's just something that I got from talking to a lot of people about crying, is that I was almost pretty universally heard from the Black folks who I spoke with that they experienced experiences of collective crying, either in the Black church or in their home growing up, or events like funerals, or there were lots of experiences of sort of collective grief, of collective weeping, in a way that I heard from very few white participants. I did not do a study. Very few white folks I interviewed, and certainly that it's not a monolith. There were there are exceptions to both sides. And like the person who I was referring to earlier, this now they do DEI HR work, Alex Love. They talk about it wasn't so much that by crying they would conform into racist stereotypes that Black people cry all the time. It was more that they would be falling into racist stereotypes that like Black people are unable to control their emotions.
Okay.
That was more the thing. But what was really interesting to me, is that I heard from a number of folks these experiences of collective weeping as a mechanism, and people drawing a direct line between that collective grief, collective weeping, collective ecstatic emotion, because it was also weeping that comes from ecstatic praise or dancing, or that would also turn into tears, as a direct way to resist racism in the United States. I talked to Kelly Brown Douglas, who we both used to work with, as one of the folks who I interviewed for the book, and she talks about crying as a humanizing experience, both in the object of the person who you are grieving, but also in the experience of crying oneself. That to cry is to affirm one's own humanity, and she posits that that's part of the reason why we have such a visceral and violent reaction to displays of public Black grief like Black Lives Matter protests. Because we don't want to affirm, the Black humanity that sits at the center of that. But she also just reflected that in a personal way, that to cry, to weep, was to declare oneself human in the middle of systems that rejected that humanity so often.
So I gather, like, the science of crying is not all that well developed in a certain sense. I mean, there's frustratingly little that we can say for sure. I mean, you first of all, in terms of kind of evolutionary function, I mean, you talk about that a little in the book. I mean, I kind of suspect that it serves multiple functions from a Darwinian point of view, and now it may serve different ones additionally in a different sense, in terms of social or personal function. But so I guess I would not be looking for the one true function
Grail.
to begin with. What did you? What's your takeaway?
Yeah, there is a frustrating lack of deep scientific research on crying. The analogy that I've somewhat been using when talking about it is Rachel Gross has a new book on the vagina that she published called Vagina Obscura, and she, in the beginning of it, talks about the incredible lack of research on non-reproductive functions of the vagina. That like just people weren't interested in that question for a very long time, and so nobody researched it because things that, and I think her takeaway is that like things that are effeminized are not treated as worthy of scientific study. And so the reproductive functions were seen as core because of their relationship to, bearing children and sort of, established patriarchal roles. But the pleasure and, other parts of the vagina just were not considered worthy of the kind of academic study. And I think that sort of falls for a lot of things that are effeminized in our culture. And I think crying being one of them, that, for a long time, it was just seen as something that like was just sort of ephemeral. It's a thing that people did. It's, it is sort of, feminine and not, uh, heroic in any kind of sense of like worthy of deep academic interest. It's also not linked to any kind of, most, disorders other than perhaps some psychiatric ones, which again, we don't treat as seriously as, real physical illnesses. And so, there's not the same kind of grant research and grant funding to do studies. It's also a difficult thing to research. Most of the science, the crying studies that exist out there, the way that they get data is they sit participants in a room and they show them a really sad movie, and they hope that, boy golly, that's sad enough to make people cry. And it's hard to think of a better research model, but it's also hard to escape the fact that like that feels a little artificial when it comes to something like crying that is often linked to these moments of extreme emotionality. That like the research findings that you get in a room full of people who just watched Brian's song is probably not the same as you would get if you were, interviewing, if you were, researching and able to gather data at the moment that like, 100 different people lost somebody, which obviously for, IRB approval would not be an improved design. And so what's interesting is that, yeah, there's no, one true answer of why we cry, in part because there's a number of different competing theories. They can be sort of broken into two fundamental camps. So there's the people who are in the like science, crying is an excretory function that lets us release stress, like biological camp. That the sort of cornerstone of that is this book called Crying: The Mystery of Tears, that William Frey, who was a neurological researcher, released in the 80s. His big finding was that they took and studied the chemical composition of people's emotional tears and compared them to the chemical composition of irritant tears, like by like blending an onion. And they found that in emotional tears, there was like a 20-something% higher protein concentration. And that specifically some of the proteins present in higher concentration in emotional tears were neurotransmitters linked to stress. And so he posited that crying was actually a way to release that stress from the brain, as in like
it certainly seems sometimes to function that way. If you just reflect on when people sometimes cry and how they seem to feel after crying, that is right. I mean, and yet I was surprised to find that it's not even that completely pinned down that on balance people feel better after crying. I mean, am I wrong about that, or is
no? You're not wrong. So now we're getting into the other side of things. So that's our biological essentialist criers with Frey and his acolytes. And then there's this guy Ad Vingerhoets, who is like the other, like he's the big guy on crying. If you're looking into crying research, you'll see his name all over the place. He's a researcher out of the Netherlands, and he really comes at crying from a social perspective. He, largely thinks that there's not a whole lot to this crying biological essentialism. And some of the studies that he has done are the ones that show that, like, oh, if you take a measure of people as they're crying, actually a lot of times they don't feel better afterwards. Now, part of the issue, I think, with some of those studies, if you parse them closely, is a lot of times they're taking that measure, how are people feeling, like right after people have stopped crying.
Right.
And I think the studies that he's done where they then come back to people, at a later point, they find that the people who cried, they felt, because crying does, gear up our somatic nervous system. You start breathing heavily, your pulse quickens, so they found that people would feel, worse in the immediate aftermath of crying. But then if you check back with them, an hour or a day later, they oftentimes would feel better than they did before the crying event itself. But his whole thing is he believes that crying is a social function, that crying is purely to elicit social support from other, humans, that was why it was evolutionarily adaptive, that it provided, and some folks will talk, evolutionary psychologists will talk about the function of a visible signal of distress
Right.
being better than an acoustic one, because, you know, if you are like, hey, a predator is coming, then the predator can also hear you. I don't know, that seems like,
yeah, although I don't,
say?
when I think of just fear, I don't think of, well, anyway, I do think it's true that, I mean, first of all, I think in Darwinian terms, laughter is interestingly comparable. Seems to happen in more than one kind of circumstance. Sometimes it's used to kind of focus derision on a person you want to exclude from a group, and the group bonds around their disdain for the person. But sometimes it can bond a group without that, and then sometimes it does other things. I think often what happens in evolutionary history is originally there's like one function, but then once you've got something, it can start serving other functions as well. And just thinking about it today, I was wondering whether, one group of people that always cry are infants, and it seems pretty clearly to be in part a signaling device. When they are in distress, they try to, it seems intended to get attention for them. And it seems to pretty reliably work, and it makes sense that evolution would design.
And not just from their parents, but any caregiver. That, like, you also, if you hear a crying infant, most people feel like I should help that infant out.
Right.
Like that.
And of course, during evolution, we would have had a not bad chance of being related to any given kid we heard cry, right? I mean, it's probably either like a niece or a second something, an
eighth cousin.
Right. But that aside, I think you're right. It's a universal signal that people hear and respond to. So it could have started that way, as a signal emitted only by infants. Who knows? And then it came to do these other things. And sometimes in adults, it may be signaling, but maybe because of the things it was supposed to signal, like I'm in distress. As it happened, then it developed the function of actually relieving stress as well as being a signal. I mean, who knows? But it does seem to be a lot of stuff. And there's also the my wife was pointing out, I was talking about your book with my wife, and that, it can be contagious. And I was thinking about, when my parents died, and siblings, and just, at funerals and things, when you're mourning, it can be kind of contagious like that. And laughter can be contagious. So it's complicated, Ben. This is probably not news to you. It's complicated.
And what I think about those contagious tears is that they actually stimulate a connection between you and the other person that's crying. That oftentimes if you cry with somebody, you feel closer with them afterwards. I've definitely cried with, total strangers before in the course of my work, and I feel differently about them than I did before I had that experience crying with them. And it's interesting, when I was reading Advinger Hoot's research on because that's what they find, is that when people cry, people on average want to provide that person assistance, and that, if they do provide them assistance, that there is, a greater, degree of, personal affection between the people than, before that exchange happened. And I found myself thinking about your book, The Evolution of God, because I think that it plays a sort of similar function oftentimes in stimulating pro-social relationship outside of our kinship circles. So that certainly, from an evolutionary perspective, you're right. When we're all in 100-person hunter-gatherer tribes, like, you're probably related in some way to anybody whose cries you might be hearing. But, sooner or later that changes. And all of a sudden you're living in, a town, a city, where you encounter all kinds of people who you don't necessarily know. And it's really, in order for that cultural evolution to proceed apace, it's essential that people develop, somewhat close emotional connections with people that they don't have any, reason to want their, evolution, their genes to survive. And I think that crying plays a really important role in stimulating that kind of pro-social relationship outside the bonds of immediate family.
Yeah, it's like it seems like whenever you see somebody crying and it seems authentic, and sometimes it doesn't. And there are some examples in your book we could talk about. But when it seems authentic, it just seems like it's always, at least to some extent, moving, right? I mean, who is not moved by the sight of genuine crying? unless you just completely dislike the person, in which case you're probably suspicious of the sincerity anyway. But I was thinking, this is by way of nothing, but we were talking about the categories of like stray male and stereotype that cowboys don't cry. One of the I mean, who more symbolizes masculinity than professional athletes, right? And yet one of the most reliable venues for crying is when a professional athlete announces his retirement.
Yep.
It usually happens. And it's just
or when they win, or like when a team wins the Super Bowl or whatever, a lot of times people will cry.
That too. Yeah. Especially, yeah. I think of especially, yeah. Yeah.
And like we have a certain cultural permissiveness for those kinds of tears that like oftentimes we don't have, like those are allowed because you won the championship, so you get to cry. You get one cry. You earned it through a championship. But what's really interesting is I think if you look in sort of the periphery, there's a fabulous photojournalism project called Fourth Place that was done at the Sydney Olympic Games, where this person took all these pictures of people coming in fourth place in all of these different Olympic categories. So they, just missing the medal stand.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them are crying. And it's like this beautiful testament to sort of resilience and failure and grief, but simultaneously you're still the fourth best person in the world at something, and I think that like crying is so often in these, we find it in these interesting places that reveal so much of like the complicated emotion. Like in that crying moment, that snap-second photograph of the person weeping in the pool, we get this whole story of the triumph of getting to that point, the failure of falling short. It's just a really beautiful, tears refract so much of our humanity.
I asked my wife if she had any questions about crying. So I'm going to hit you with a couple.
Love this.
Here's one that's kind of interesting. I don't know if you'll have anything to say about it. Crying is caused by emotion. Does it also cause emotion?
I think so. Or at least I don't think so. When I started writing the book, I really thought about crying as like the end point to an emotion.
Uh-huh.
Or like it's the exclamation point. The product of all of the, the some emotional experiences preceding it. And I don't really think that anymore. The more I talk to people about crying, the more I wrote about it, the more I thought about it, I really see crying as sort of an ellipsis, as a doorway of sorts, that it, we enter with an emotion, and very often crying helps that emotion sort of move through our bodies. So we see that in, an experience of grieving over a loved one. Oftentimes at the end of it, it's not that, the emotion is gone. You're like, oh, not sad about grandma anymore. You're still in that grieving place, but your grief is different.
Right.
And so I think that, in as much as it causes emotion, I would say that, it modulates the emotions that we're experiencing. One of the other really fascinating interviews I did for the book was with this psychological researcher who was really fascinated by why art makes people cry. Because he actually started off as an artist, and then he was at a Rothko exhibit and he saw all of these people weeping in front of Rothko paintings. And he was like, well, that's weird. They're just big voluminous blocks of color. Like clearly if you're crying, it's not the painting, it's like something's happening in you.
Mm-hmm.
And he sort of has this whole model of crying as a psychological journey, that like when people engage with a piece of art, very often they'll enter into this liminal space where they let their guard down in a way that they wouldn't, at the supermarket. And they go in with this expectation that like, oh yeah, I can engage with this piece of art and it's going to be fine. I'm just going to be the same on the other side as I was when I went in. And then oftentimes, because you've lowered your guard, you have this transformative experience with this piece of art, and now you're crying, and now you don't know what's going to happen. And you all of a sudden have dug up this stuff that was already there to begin with, but now you're really experiencing in full. And so I think that crying experience absolutely oftentimes becomes a doorway, a portal where we start to cry because we feel a little something. And then as we continue crying, we realize that, that little something we were feeling was just the tip of this much deeper art iceberg that we were carrying around. We hadn't really, delved into fully.
Mm-hmm. Another wife question. I'm guessing there's more than one answer to this, and you may or may not be conversant in the subject, but how do actors make themselves cry?
Yeah. So, I think that there are, are we talking about good actors or bad actors? No, I've heard that there's some people who, like before the camera starts rolling, you put some, drops in the eyes.
We call those bad actors.
Squeeze one out. Yeah. So if we put those people aside, what I've heard from, because I did interview some actors about how they cry, and they reported just, that the way you do that is you feel the emotion. Like that's the good acting, is that you actually make yourself feel the kind of emotion that would produce those tears. And so then those tears aren't something that you're consciously trying to produce. They're just, you have so firmly embodied that emotional experience that you are now, genuinely crying. It's one of the reasons why I think, as you alluded earlier to, like, oh, when we think tears are deceptive, or, particularly if we don't like the person, we will, assume that they're deceptive. I think very oftentimes people who I find odious are crying very genuine tears. Like, I think about, like, Kyle Rittenhouse on the witness stand, and there were all these people being like, oh my God, he was faking crying. I'm actually not sure. I think that he very much believed that this was a very unfair thing that he was having to go through, that, like, how dare, people, fault him for taking care of himself and his country by, patrolling the streets with a rifle. And I think that those tears that he was weeping were genuine tears. I think, what we need to stop doing is arguing about whether or not tears are genuine, and start talking about, what is the thing that is producing the tears, and realize that, a lot of the people we find odious, it's not the fact that they're, faking crying. It's that these tears are grounded in, fundamentally destructive ideologies.
Yeah, that's interesting, because, as we said, crying sometimes presumably serves a kind of signaling function, and one kind of, this isn't quite what he was doing at the time, probably, but it can signal regret, even apology, like, I'm sorry. People can break down crying, and it can increase the chances that you will be granted forgiveness. And on the one hand, I would say you could call that, to the extent that it is functioning as this signal, and to the extent that you may not have felt nearly so much remorse the day before when you weren't looking for forgiveness in front of this person. And in that sense, it may be performative. I also think that doesn't mean it's a conscious performance. In other words, it may serve the function of eliciting forgiveness, and for that reason, you may do it when you're suddenly confronted with the person you want forgiveness from. But that doesn't mean you're consciously faking it, right? I mean,
yeah. I think very often we feel a real thing, even if the reason that we feel that thing is not particularly noble.
Right. Now, that said, here's a test case. And I mean, that said, sometimes it is probably consciously performative. And an interesting test case, you brought up Joel Osteen in your book, famous
I do.
televangelist. First of all, could we pause and just have a moment of admiration for his sheer oratorical technique? And I'm not really kidding here. I mean,
yeah,
he's
I'm
good.
not either.
He's good. He's not, now for my money, he's 2% too theatrical. So he doesn't, if you compare him to, say, Billy Graham, whom I had a lot more respect for. I look, Joel Osteen, I don't mean to shower disrespect on anybody, but let's face it. Anyway, let's not get off on it. But he is an amazing, whatever you want to call it, performer. I mean, he does these sermons that look as if he gives them every week, but they look as if he'd spent a year on each one. He doesn't seem to refer to any notes, and every sentence is accompanied by some kind of appropriate gesture, and he's really good. But anyway, in the book, you talk about his crying, and I don't think you claim it's performative. On the other hand, you're not as sympathetic toward his crying as you are toward some people's crying. He's like a prosperity gospel guy, for people who don't know. He's like, you can become rich by accepting my version of what the New Testament is all about.
And by giving me money. I mean, like that is like
and by making me a little richer. Yes.
If you give me money, your blessings that you have given me will be, rewarded to you tenfold. And if it doesn't happen, well, you probably weren't praying good. I mean, so to your point, he is an incredibly effective orator. I mean, that's why he's been able to, amass this gigantic, empire of prayer. TM. I think the crying for me, and what it does and the function it serves in that oratory, is it makes him appear vulnerable. It connects him to his audience, because all of a sudden this person, particularly in a context like that, where, you know, this person has incredible situational power. You know, they are both the head pastor in this church and also just, you know, one of the, you know, leading Christian, you know, voices in the sort of right-wing Christian world, you know, tons of books and appearances on Oprah, you know, yada, yada, yada. It would be very easy for that person to start feeling like they were not a real person, you know? Like it would be very easier for people to look at him and be like, oh, there's Joel in his giant mansion with all his cars and his, you know, and that really, you know, doesn't do great things for the for the preaching brand. And so I think what that crying does is it makes him appear, you know, vulnerable, like anybody else. You know, here's Joel. He's just trying to do his best. He's just living, you know, one day at a time, like the rest of us. He puts his shoes on one foot after the other. He, you know, like us, experiences, you know, setback and heartbreak, and I'm not saying that he doesn't experience those things, but you know, the irony of, you know, this facade of humility coming from somebody who lives in a $20 million mansion is a little thick. You know, and so when he, you know, talks to Oprah in this interview from his, you know, palace, you know, from Avignon, and says,
which according to your book is 17,500 square feet. That's super big. Go ahead.
Really big. I mean, that's so big you probably need one of those like mall signs. You're like, you're in the East Wing. But yeah, so he you know, and in this conversation with her, he's like, yeah, you know, just God has blessed us in the way that, like, I would say that if I were like, I have a book. Look at this. I did it. I wrote it. I'm so excited. Like, he's talking about, you know, $100 million and this palace in Texas in the same way that I would refer to, like, oh, I'm so excited my kid got an A, you know, like, and it's the same kind of vocal tone. It's the same kind of vulnerable, you know, inflection, but it is obscuring the central truth about all of this wealth and power that he has amassed. And I think that for me is like in that chapter on, you know, I call it crocodile tears and something. The difference between manipulative tears is not so much whether or not they are real in the emotionality of the person who's experienced them. It's, do they reveal the truth or do they cover it up? And I think that for me, that's the defining difference is, you know, there are a lot of kinds of weeping that are covering up a central truth rather than, you know, the kinds of weeping that I find really beautiful and powerful and moving, and I think you know we should aspire to, which are the kinds of tears that reveal something that's true about ourselves and what we believe about the world.
Now, this leads to a pushback question.
Love that.
I have to give everyone pushback. So it was just kind of a little in the chapter in which you mentioned Osteen. I think it's the same chapter.
Yeah.
In any event, you somewhere in the book you talk about him. You also talk about someone who it was a beggar on the street, and you kind of, I mean, first there's this anecdote from when you were a kid, and there was somebody saying to your father, you know, I lost I need cab fare to get home. Your dad's reluctant. You pushed him into giving him the money. Oh, and the guy said, I swear I'll pay you back. Just tell me where you live or whatever. And he never shows up, and your parents had to explain to you, look, it was a con. These things happen. That's why I was reluctant to give him the money in the first place. And then you give us an anecdote where more recently you gave money to a beggar, and you say, look, did I really think his story was true? Well, you know, maybe not, but I felt if I don't believe it, well, you fill that out. But anyway, I guess my question is, why don't you say the same thing about Joel Osteen? And there were a few other examples. Well, you mentioned one, Rittenhouse. You just you seem to have different attitudes to people, all of whose crying seemed susceptible to the same level of skepticism in principle.
Yeah, I mean, sense? For me, I think it boils in part down to a power analysis that, like, there is a power and danger in sort of the sanctifying power of Rittenhouse's tears, or in the sort of predatory theology of Joel Osteen that is not present in this guy who is, you know, outside of Columbia Presbyterian Hospital asking me for money. You know, and so yeah, he told me this whole story about how, oh, his his wife and was in, the hospital, and he needed to get back to his kids and, wherever he lived, and he didn't have enough money to get the train. There's a whole thing. And like all of the alarm bells were ringing in my head. Like I was like, I don't think this is true. And to decide that and to not give him money, there's a cynicism there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like one that I don't like to feed. And so I didn't give him like, $60.
Give him a
I
credit
gave him a
card.
couple bucks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't like, but I gave him a couple dollars because, he's here. He is, at the very least, what I think is true is that he needed the money. And so I'm willing to give him the money because he's asking for money on the street. I mean, and again, this is sort of it's a power analysis place where like, if you are standing on the street asking strangers who are passing by for money, you probably need that $2 more than I needed it at that particular moment. And I'm happy to give it to you. And I do kind of want to live in that world where I still believe that maybe that's true, that maybe he really did need the money to go and, get back to his kids after visiting his wife. I don't know. Again, I have my suspicions, but I try not to feed those suspicions about other people, particularly when they're coming from a place of vulnerability, feigned or otherwise.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, the Rittenhouses, Amy Cooper's, we could go through the list of people who've sort of wielded tears for reasons that I find, personally odious. For me, the defining point there is like, are you using your tears to escape accountability for violence, to, continue to amass power? Somebody like, Brett Kavanaugh weeping during the Supreme Court nomination hearings. Like, there are, to me, very clear, ways those tears, regardless of whether or not they're being genuinely felt, their function is to continue amassing power for somebody who has shown to use that power abusively, and who, in the aftermath of that decision, has continued to use power abusively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Amy Cooper is a woman who, I guess in Central Park, she had a dog off a leash, right, which was against the rules. And then there was a black guy who
bird watching.
He was bird watching and kind of reprimanded her, and then she called the police. And I guess the shady thing that got people's attention was she said there's an African American man doing this when she dialed 911. And of course, there are cases where a visual description of a person is appropriate, like if they're at large and the police are looking for him. But it wasn't kind of obvious why that was the first thing she had to tell them. I will say on her behalf that his own account of what he said to her included one thing that could be taken as kind of a threat to her dog in a weird way. I forget what it was. Look, she was obviously kind of unstable and was reacting. First of all, you shouldn't have your dog off a leash. That kind of thing drives me nuts. But she was reacting.
And it was like the repetition too, that like, then like, clearly you only hear the one side, her side of the conversation, but like after she doesn't get the response she wants, she emphasizes like African American, and the next time she says it, she's like,
is that the way it was?
African American man. Yeah, like the gambit is a little clear.
You don't understand. This is no ordinary man.
He has a bike helmet, I mean, but I think the part of what makes people so mad about those kinds of experiences, one, obviously it's like the sordid history of American racism where, all too often those kinds of tears had lethal consequences. But there's also a part of us that just gets really mad when we see people misusing, like, to our eyes, misusing vulnerability, because it's such a betrayal when we find out we've been scammed, when we find out that somebody, cried to us, and then we later find out, oh, that was just, a facade. Like, it feels like a personal betrayal because it is preying upon our own empathy and trust. That like we really I think most of us long to have, that we long to move through the world, being able to trust that when we come into contact with another human being, particularly if they are expressing vulnerability and a need for assistance, that if we then, meet them there, that will have been grounded in the truth. And so to, see somebody who is in a manifestly not dangerous situation, talking in a way that expressed clear and present danger, and using tears and vulnerability to do that is, I think, something that makes a lot of people really, really angry, on top of the whole racism aspect of it. Just that misuse of vulnerability as a form of sort of aggression I think makes people instinctively really, really upset, because it's a violation of something really beautiful about ourselves, which is that we want to care for people if they're experiencing duress.
Yeah. So here's another question from my wife. Do we cry more in certain stages of life, and are the triggers that elicit tears different in different stages? And let me add to that. I mean, she mentions toddlers as having their own kind of set of crying,
Sure.
and she also says, do men and women cry more or less than each other at different stages, and so on. There's a lot there. I would say that one thing that occurred to me when I was reading about what you opened this conversation with, which was that long period where you didn't cry, was like, I
Yeah.
was kind of thinking, I don't think between the ages of kind of 12 and whatever college, I don't think I did much crying. It's funny. I remember when I was like about 12, I did something that, it's a long story, but I dropped a pillow from anyway, I broke a lamp. My mother was really mad, and I started like crying, and she just looked at me like, dude, like, and I just thought, on the one hand, it felt kind of, I didn't think I'm acting and pretending to cry. The crying just came. But then when she looked at me like that, I thought, yeah, this is just tactical crying. I'm too old for this. And I kind of think I don't know that I don't remember crying. I don't know when the next time I remember crying is. But so I was wondering, is the period during which you didn't cry, is that kind of a common period not to cry, or maybe for males in particular? Anyway, with that as prelude, you can say
Yeah.
whatever you want about my wife's question.
Love that. I love these missives from Mrs. Wright, though. This is fabulous. It's a good.
Yeah. There are lots of them, but I'm just focusing on the ones related to crime.
Yeah. So a few things. On average, men definitely cry less than women, or gender inventive folks. A lot, to the degree that a lot of crying research actually excludes male participants entirely, because they're just like, oh, it's so habitually hard to make men cry, particularly in the kind of laboratory settings that crying research happens, that they're like, if we have a 50-50 study, that just means that 50% of the data we're just gonna have to exclude from the bat. And so they will only use female participants. I think, that divide, I don't actually believe is a really physiological one. I think it's a product of socialization. In her book,
I might disagree, but go ahead. I mean, I'm sure there is a cultural component, but it would,
yeah,
given
given
the fact that during
all
evolution,
or nothing.
Yeah.
I don't think it's all or nothing, but I think that it's a combination of maybe perhaps, a somewhat different proclivity to cry that is then like robustly shaped through a lots of different, forces of acculturation. I would say that, like, in the folks who I heard, and not just men, but like the folks who I heard who talked about, not crying for a while and then learning how to cry again, that it oftentimes did coincide with the same period that I was talking about. That, like, in later childhood, they stopped crying, and then in their 20s or 30s, they sort of learned how to cry again. And I think for me, what that is indicative of is that you have kids who sort of are, we're all born with a natural proclivity to cry, to solicit assistance, and that persists in most children for, quite some time. That, like, toddlers and children, are generally pretty open about crying when, for a whole host of different reasons. And then in various different ways, we all learn that it's not appropriate, or that maybe there are situations where it's appropriate, but other ones where it's not, where it's not appropriate. And that's the confusing lesson to learn. And so sometimes it's easier to just not cry at all, rather than try to, do that work of discerning when it's not appropriate. And then lots of other kids are just, flat out told, don't cry, in, lots of explicit ways or implicit ways. I include some examples in my book of, like, memories I have of watching other adults, tell their kids explicitly, don't cry. There are lots of the folks who I, interviewed who report, having their parents be like, no, that's not acceptable behavior. And I think a lot of times, rarely, do people say that to their 3-year-old like this. I think most parents have at least a little bit more compassion than that. But there comes a time where, like, a lot of parents are like, oh, well, you're more grown now, and that means that you don't cry. And so I think that, there then becomes this period where, from sort of early adolescence to early adulthood, that crying becomes extinguished in a lot of people. Certainly not everybody, And I think that is a real harm that we do to a whole host of people. And
Hmm.
then those people end up having to sort of relearn. A lot of them start to cry again in their 20s and 30s because they recognize, like I did, that like, oh, there's something missing in my emotionality. Like I'm not a full person in the way that I used to be at some point in time. And so then they have to do that work of sort of regaining and relearning how to feel.
Hmm.
And so like, a lot of folks who I, spoke with then are feeling this sort of second shame, that they had this shame that they felt about crying, that they learned for whatever reasons that they learned to be shamed about crying as a kid. And now they have all this shame because they don't feel like they're emotionally available to the people in their lives. Or they feel like they're, that they have all this, pent up feeling inside of them that they can't let out. All these different reasons that they now feel this shame that they're not able to cry. And it's just this real, really
Yeah.
sad state of affairs that we inculcate in so many children.
Do you get a sense that older people, in the sense of like 60s, 70s, report crying? Well, I'm kind of wondering, it could work both ways. On the one hand, I mean, speaking as someone who's closer to the end of my life than the beginning, on the one hand, it seems like you're better at absorbing ups and downs and rolling, with the punches. On the other hand, there's a sense in which you are more sensitive to certain aspects of the poignance and tragedy of life. I don't know. I'm trying. I don't know. Is there any conventional wisdom on like whether uh, what the deal is with old people and crying?
Well, and I think it's complicated too because you're also, then factoring in generational differences in the ways that like
Right,
different
that's true.
generations were raised.
That's true.
And so I definitely heard, from some older folks who I interviewed who were just talking about how crying was really not appropriate when they were growing up, in a way that like now that they're older, they feel like the culture has also shifted. And so not only are they more likely to cry, they also just recognize that, that it's a different, it feels different crying now for them than it did when they were, a younger
Hmm.
person. And so, but I do think that there's a sort of reflectiveness that, oftentimes accompanies the weeping in companies that is true for a lot of older people. I see that even just in like my own grandfather, hearing the stories about him that like my uncles and my dad would tell about him just being a much more sort of stoic and
Hmm.
brusque person at times. Then now, like he's a much more emotional person than the sort of stories I would hear about when my parents were growing up. Um, and so I think that is some transformation that happens through people's lives. But I also think it's interesting, the kinds of generational divides. When I talk about uh, my book with the Gen Z crowd, they love it. A lot of them like never had they were really raised to like embrace their crying, and they're like, yeah, this is great. I love that you're writing about crying. I cry all the time. In a way that I didn't find as much with sort of even like members of my millennial cohort, which are only uh, 10 years older.
Hmm.
But I think the cultural differences that happened over the course of even that short 10-year gap have really changed the way that kids are growing up.
Yeah.
And so I think that those are reflected even more broadly when we're thinking about people in their 70s and people in their 20s.
Yeah, I don't think I ever saw my father cry, and for that matter, my daughters have, I think, only seen me cry once. So it's not getting in my lineage. It's not improving at a very rapid rate. So so listen, we've been talking about an hour. One thing I've been doing with this podcast lately is going ahead and after an hour, which has always been kind of roughly the length of these conversations. Spending some time in kind of overtime. This part is available only to members of the Nonzero newsletter, paid subscribers to the Nonzero newsletter. Um, I should add that anybody can become one. If in the show notes in the podcast app, there's a link you can click, or you can just kind of Google Nonzero Substack and go there. And then once you're a paid subscriber, um, you can set up your own podcast feed that will always have the longer versions of these things. And you have been kind enough to agree to stick around a little while, Ben, while we talk more.
Let's take it
I
to the
want
money
to.
zone.
What's that?
I said, let's take it to the money zone.
To the money zone. Come on, we use euphemisms. Well, you saw I was kind of vacillating between members, paid subscribers. You know, we try to avoid explicit references to commerce. That's what works for Joel Osteen. I want to in overtime. I do want to talk a little about first of all, my most embarrassing adult crying experience. I also want to talk a little about psychedelics and crying. You may not have realized we were going to talk about that. We are.
Love that.
And then whatever you want to talk about and various other things. But first, before we go into overtime, I want to give you a chance to say anything else you would like to say about the book that you think we haven't covered adequately. Again, it's called Cry Baby, with a comma after cry, Why Our Tears Matter. It's just out, brand new. And what would you like to say in closing?
If I could, I'll read the blessing for crying that I end the book with.
That sounds good.
So a nice little way that I like to, that I closed the book, and it's a nice way to close this little podcast. Although you really should subscribe and join the.
Absolutely. However moving what you're about to read is, it pales in comparison
so much
with what
better
happens
afterwards
behind the paywall.
Yeah, you want to hear the pastor talk about the psychedelic effects of crying.
Yeah,
I guarantee it. But because I'm a pastor, I'll leave you with a benediction. If you've lost your tears, may you find them again. Know that you are never beyond redemption and worthy of full emotional life. May crying nourish you, a balm for the wounds you still carry, and a salve on fresh hurt. As droplets fall, may they water new growth, and may our collective weeping shape a world better than the one we inherited. May we attune ourselves to grief and hold the places we are broken, repairers of the breach. May cries long silenced be heard in full, yeast for our communal rising. Hold each other fiercely, not to build a future where every eye is dry, but one where we weep copiously from the joy and tenderness of living.
That's very good. And you mentioned joy. We didn't even get into very much into tears of joy. We mentioned athletes sometimes crying after triumph, but that's also a big part of it. Anyway, we can talk about some of this in overtime, which we're headed into now. Meanwhile, thank you for this. I encourage everybody to get the book and read it. And that was a lovely kind of benediction.